This is my final year project Yakuza Like a Serpent at 2.5D level. Here is a top-down view of my first level, Osaka City. The bottom right is the starting point of the level and the end point is the top left of the level. This is the first area, Ichiban's bar. The blue materials on assets such as the tables and chairs mean that they can be picked up to be used in combat. The red material such as the door here means it can be interacted with. And finally, the brown-red coloured squares here are just a scale of environmental windows. All are named conventionally to be easily recognisable by artists and programmers and visually colour-coded. Plus, if I went far away in the viewport without any colour coding, it was hard to identify these assets. The blue text below the area's location, which is here, is to say where cutscenes initiate for the programmers. This text explains the first cutscene that will occur. After the cutscene, the player has to fight the first three standing enemies that attacked Ichiban Kasuga. The red material tells the programmers and artists that they are standard enemies. The player learns how to do light and heavy attacks on these enemies. Also note that standard enemies only fight with their fists. I thought this was the best option as you don't want to throw the player into the game without them getting used to it, especially since this is a starting level. After players defeat the standard enemies, the next set of standard enemies spawn from outside. They spawn when one of the previous enemies on the floor calls for backup and they walk into the bar. When the next set of enemies are inside, the player learns how to dodge attacks and jump away from them to avoid them and block them, or pick up props to attack with until they break. After the fight, this cutscene initiates. The cutscene ends with Ichiban exiting his bar. Here is the next area, the alleyway outside of Ichiban's bar. Of course, once the player gets here, the camera angle will change to face somewhere this way. Outside of Ichiban's bar, you'll see these large bin blockouts. The colour code on these mean that they are for environmental purposes only. Whereas a normal bin here, it's light blue, so it may be able to be picked up to be used in combat. Of course, the window blockouts here are the same ones from inside the bar. Moving further in the alleyway, you'll see there's a big yellow line here. This is to say there's a trigger box here that spawns the enemies on the right. You'll also notice that the alleyway shops here use the same door and entrance colour code as the door from Ichiban's bar. You can't enter these places as just environmental shops. To ensure that's given off clearly, the colour code on the shelter part of the shops say they are environmental shops. All the assets in front of the shops, the plant pots, shop signs, are blocked out by myself and can be picked up to be used in combat. The text here explains what the standard enemies within the alleyway do and spawn from. Moving to the final area of the alleyway, I wanted to give the player a bit of a break so no enemies spawn here. It's just blocked out for environmental and gameplay reasons. All assets again here apart from one, and that's the bin that I have selected, are blocked out by myself. The bin and other assets that I may mention further in this project are all taken by different users on Sketchfab, which is great because this helped me produce more of the levels I wanted to and focus less on asset development and more on levels. The camera angle of course changes on this bend. After the alleyway, the player will make their way to the streets of Osaka. The player will come out of the alleyway here and of course the camera angle will change too. I would like to point out that the camera will be focused in a way where the player doesn't realise they can go left on this part of the level, leading them to proceed towards objective then explore for other things within the level. So what I have done is I made another alleyway in between the two shops. Within it there is a collectible, a Tojo Clan Dojima family badge. It will do a shine animation to make it easily noticeable as it's really small. Of course you can see its small white colour code dot here. Also I would like to note that the colour code doors here are for environmental purposes only. The player won't be able to interact with them. Finally, I would like to say when the player does go into this alleyway, the camera angle shouldn't really change as the player can just move up and down freely throughout the level. Before I proceed, I'd like to say these benches and bicycles scattered throughout the level are also taken from Sketchfab. Moving on now, you'll see there's another trigger box here that spawns these enemies. The text explains what they do. I'd like to point out the blue enemies are enemies with knives. After these enemies are defeated, these next set of enemies spawn. The text explains what happens when they spawn and come in the view of the player. I would like to note as an Easter egg, since Yakuza is a Sega title and the series always has a Sega arcade store within it, I placed one within my level. It can't be entered, it's just there for environmental purposes. To ensure it was given off clear that it's a Sega store for the artists and programmers, I popped the Sega logos where necessary, which is taken from the internet, and added the environmental shop colours on the shelter part of the store. And finally, just in case, put a Sega store text above the shop. Anyways, after the player has defeated these enemies and has proceeded further down here, the camera angle comes to about here on the player and then follows the player down the level. Then switches back to a 2.5D camera angle when they get to about here. However, before they do get here, the player is introduced to their first consumable here. This text explains what this consumable and other consumables do. The next area is Osaka City Bridge. Also, this door is for environmental purposes. The player won't be able to go towards it. Again, just color code to be easily visible by artists and programs. Before I proceed with saying what happens here, I would like to say these cones were also taken from Sketchfab. This trigger box spawns 7 enemies at the end of the bridge over here. Again, the text explains what these enemies do, and I would like to point out the green enemies are tank enemies. Players are then introduced to dining or rest areas after the fight on Osaka Bridge. This text explains what they do and how they differentiate from other consumables. When the player reaches this area, the camera angle changes to face this way. The final trigger box within the level spawns these enemies. The text explains how many of what enemies spawn and dialogue that occurs. After the enemies are defeated, the player will reach the final area, Osaka's train station. They will be prompted to walk down it, opening the final level. Here's a top-down view in engine of the final level, Osaka's train station. The player will come from right and make their way down here. The trigger box spawns the final boss Red Yoshida here, initiating a cutscene which this text explains here. The text above the boss explains his mechanics. The yellow text above the train explains a world mechanic. Also, I want to note the colours on the trains are different compared to the props, as is the colour of world mechanic objects. As you can see, I have pop clearing boxes on the left and right of the staircases. I have selected them in the top down view of the level. They were implemented to make sure the player isn't able to head back upstairs.